turning it around so quickly. We've never had rain in 10 years here. By 10 o'clock in the morning, everything had been turned around, new venues found, everything shipped around. It was an incredible response. And thank you for you guys for turning up in the rain and not being put off. Thank you so much. The man who Artemis Cooper is going to talk about is not an author who I've ever seen in any Indian bookshop. So it's a great tribute to your questing spirits that you're here to listen to her. But presumably, few of you have actually read his work. He is, in my view, the greatest writer of English non-fiction prose at the end of the last century, and certainly in non-fiction. He's a writer who completely inspired me and made me want to be a travel writer when I read him at Cambridge at the age of 18. A Time of Gifts and A Time to Keep Silence are two of the most beautifully written books, certainly the two most beautifully written travel books I've ever read. But what is so unusual about Patrick Leigh Fermor is that most of us writers leave quiet, reclusive lives. We occasionally get on stage and have fun at the Jaipur or another literary festival, then we go back to our computers for another year. Patrick Leigh Fermor had one of the most swashbuckling and exciting lives of any writer since Drake or Raleigh, probably. I mean, it's very difficult to think of many other writers outside perhaps the First World War poets who had a more action-packed life. Artemis is going to talk for 45, 50 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to you guys to have questions.
Right, if we can have the first slide, is that okay? Nope, that's number 2. That's the first one. I'd like to begin this because I'm not really going to talk about the travel writing. I wanted to start with something that's going to give you a flavor of his writing, which is quite extraordinary. It's very elaborate in some ways, beautifully crafted. And this particular passage was written in the mid-50s. It comes from a book called Mani. And he's on a boat, a little ferry boat going between the islands. And suddenly, this little boat, by the way, is called the Aphrodite. That comes in a bit later. I'm a bit boomy here. Is it all right? Or is it too high? Uh-oh. Are we okay? Oh, no, I think we're still okay. Oh, the slides have gone. Ah, interesting. Never mind. We'll carry on. So the little boat is called the Aphrodite, and they're sailing between the islands. Soon the delighted cry of "Delphinia" went up. A school of dolphins was gambling half a mile further out to sea. They seemed to have spotted us at the same moment, for in a second, half a dozen were tearing their way towards us, all surfacing in the same parabola and plunging together as though they were in some invisible harness. Soon they were careering alongside and round the bows and under the bowsprit, glittering muscle blue on top, fading at the sides through gunmetal dune-like markings to pure white, streamlined and gleaming from their elegant beaks to the clean-cut flukes of their tails. They were beautiful abstractions of speed, energy, power, and ecstasy, leaping out of the water, plunging and spiraling and vanishing like swift shadows, each soon to materialize again and sail in the air in another great loop, so fast that they seemed to draw the sea after them and shake it off in midair, to plunge forward again, tearing two great frothing bow waves with their beaks, and diving down again and falling behind and crisscrossing under the keel and deviating and returning. Sometimes they flung themselves out of the sea with the insane abandon, in reverse, of a suicide from a skyscraper, up until they hung poised in midair, shaking in a muscular convulsion from beak to tail, as though resolved to abandon their element forever. But gravity, as though hauling on an oblique fishing line, dragged them forward and down again into their rifled and bubbling green tunnels. The headlong speed through the water filled the air with a noise of rending and searing, and each leap into the air called forth a chorus of gasps, and each plunge a sigh. These creatures bring a blessing with them. No day in which they've played a part is like other days. I first saw them at dusk many years ago on the way to Mount Athos. A whole troop appeared alongside the steamer, racing her and keeping us company for 3/4 of an hour. Slowly, it grew darker, and as the night fell, the phosphorescent water turned them into fishes of pale fire. White-hot flames whirled from them, and when they leapt from the water, they shook off 1,000,000 fiery diamonds, and when they plunged, it was like a fall of comets, spinning down fathom after fathom, league upon league of dark sky, it seemed, in whirling, incandescent vortices, always to rise again, until at last, streaming down all together as though the heavens were falling, and each trailing a ribbon of blazing and feathery wake, they became a far-away constellation on the sea's floor. And they suddenly turned and vanished, dying away into the abyss like ghosts. And again, 4 years ago, I was sailing in a yacht with 6 friends through the outer Cyclades, one late afternoon of a long and dreamlike day, and there was another visitation. The music from the deck over the water and the first champagne cork had fired its sighting shot over the side, and the steep flanks of Sikinos, tinkling with goat bells and aflutter with birds, rose up to starboard, and close to the port, the sheer cliffs of Nereid-haunted Folegandros. Islands enclosed the still sea like a lake at the end of the world, and a few bars of unlikely summer cloud lay across the west. And then, some distance off, a dolphin sailed into the air, summoned from the depths, perhaps, by the strains of water music. And another, and yet another, until a small company were flying and diving and chasing each other and hovering in mid-air in static semicircles, gambling and curvetting and almost playing leapfrog, trying to stand on tiptoe, pirouetting, jumping over the setting sun. And all we could hear was an occasional splash, and so smooth was the water that one could see the spreading rings where they swooped below the surface. And the sea became a meadow, and these antics like the last game of children on a lawn before going to bed. Leaning spellbound over the bulwarks and in the rigging, we watched them in silence, and all at once, on a sudden decision, they vanished. Just as they vanish now from the side of the Aphrodite, off the stern, into the shadowless rocks of the Mani. "Galaenaita delphinia," the captain said when they'd gone. Dolphins are good. Now, I'm so sorry, do we have slides or do we not have slides? We have no slides. In that case, I'm so sorry. Willie, could you pass me my bag, because I've got to get the no slides talk. Do apologise. No, it's a white one. It's a white bag. It's a white bag with a black bottom. That's the one. Wonderful, thank you. Don't worry, this is all going entirely according to plan. That's like, sorry?
You may get the slides yet. So.
Oh no, well, don't worry. No, we're not going to do slides because that will just mess things up. That will just mess things up. So we're going to do it without slides now. No slides at all. Doesn't matter. It's just as good this way. So, ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard that extraordinary piece by a writer who, yes, is very elaborate, but it's intensely visual, very beautiful, very crafted. And he was one of those people, when you met him, who seemed almost too good to be true. He responded to everyone he met with ease and generosity, and no one wore their learning so lightly. His conversation ranged effortlessly through history, architecture, art, literature, and he knew reams of poetry by heart. And he could sing songs in French, German, Romanian, Bulgarian, Italian, Dog Latin, and Hindi. And those are just the ones I heard. During the Second World War, he headed the Anglo-Cretan team that kidnapped General Heinrich Kreiper and whisked him off the island of Crete under the very noses of the enemy. But it is above all his writing for which he's remembered now. Bruce Chatwin, Jan Morris, William Dalrymple all hail him as the greatest travel writer of the 20th century. And for the literary critic John Gross, he was in the top flight of English prose stylists of any generation. All this, plus Byronic good looks and encyclopedic knowledge, no wonder women found him irresistible, and his company enlivened every party, picnic or expedition that he ever joined. As one of his old friends put it, If only Paddy came in pill form so you could take one whenever you felt depressed. Now, of course, all this suggests someone with a natural self-confidence, which indeed he had, although his teens had been filled with more disappointment than success. His parents were not a happy couple, and the emotional instability and turbulence of his youth go a long way to explaining why his first experience of travelling alone gave him such a feeling of liberation and fulfillment. His father, Leigh Fermor, was a distinguished geologist who spent most of his life in Kolkata as director of the Geological Survey of India, while his mother, Eileen Taff-Ambler, was an impulsive, imaginative romantic who loved acting and playing the piano. Their first child was called Vanessa Opal, and she was born in 1911. Her father liked the idea of his children being called after semi-precious stones. But Eileen was on her own and in England for the birth of her second child, a boy, who was born in London on the 11th of February, 1915. And thanks to his father's absence, he was not christened Jasper or Garnet, but Patrick Michael Leigh Fermor. The First World War was already well underway. England had undergone U-boat attacks and Zeppelin raids by the time Eileen felt that she really had to get back to Calcutta. And by then, even civilian shipping had come under enemy attack. So she dared not risk taking both children with her. She sailed back to India with her 4-year-old daughter, Vanessa, and the cheerful baby she called Paddy Mike was put into the care of Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Martin in the village of Weedon Beck in Northamptonshire. Now, the Martins were a very kind and loving family, and for 4 years, little Paddy Mike tumbled about in a sort of infant Neverland where he was never scolded or punished and just allowed to do whatever he liked. And he was wrenched from this happy paradise in 1919 when his mother came back to England and the long years of school began. Paddy was good at languages, literature, history, and he was keen to learn. But he was also, I'm afraid, an uncontrollable troublemaker. If anyone was caught smoking behind the bike sheds, climbing on the school roof, or laying illicit bets on the Grand National, you could guarantee it was Fermor. He was sacked from school after school, culminating with the King's School, Canterbury, from which he was famously expelled for holding hands with the greengrocer's daughter. His parents hoped that he might join the army, but in his heart, Paddy knew he would get into as much trouble with army regulations as he had done with school rules. And by the age of 18, his life seemed to lack any direction at all. Living in Shepherd Market in London, lurching aimlessly from one party to another, he was outwardly carefree, inwardly sunk in gloom. And of course, all his elders and betters were saying, "Why don't you get a job? Why don't you find a career? Why don't you start a profession?" But of course, all that sounded to him like life imprisonment. All he wanted to do was write. But of course, at that stage, he had nothing to write about, except his inner turmoil. And the solution came from one moment to the next. Living on his allowance of £4 a month, in purchasing power, I reckon that would be about $300 in today's money, he would walk across Europe, from the Hook of Holland to the city we know as Istanbul, which he always called by its Greek name, Constantinople. And from the moment he left England in December 1933, he was filled with a sense of unlimited freedom and a joy so intense that it touched everything. Living in a yeasty ferment of excitement, he wrote, "I grudged every second of sleep. All that I heard, smelt, touched, tasted, or read was brand new, and the intake, total and continuous, was crowding in to bursting point, and I was unborable like an unsinkable battleship." It was snowing in Holland, and in Germany, Hitler had been in power for about 9 months. Paddy was a political innocent, but he soon developed a visceral hatred of Nazism. He went on through Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, a journey of over 2,000 miles that took just over a year. And he arrived in Constantinople on New Year's Day, 1935. But the journey wasn't over yet, and he longed to explore Greece. He spent several weeks in the monasteries of Mount Athos, where the monks helped him to turn the smattering of ancient Greek he'd learnt at school into Demotic. And after that, he spent a month on horseback, exploring the wilds of Thrace and Macedonia. And that spring, he took a bus to Athens, where he met the first great love of his life, a Romanian princess called Balasha Cantacuzin. She had been married to a Spanish diplomat, and she was 16 years older than Paddy. But being romantic and artistic, she was touched by his youth and brilliance, and I like to think she gave him a bit of polish and curbed his tendency to show off and talk too much. They lived together for the next 4 years in Greece, London, and Romania. Paddy already spoke French, German, and Latin, to which he now added Romanian, and he'd also made his first attempts to write up the Great Walk, though he was not very pleased with the results. It was in September 1939, of course, that war broke out, and Balasha was in her car when she heard that England was at war with Germany. And she knew at once from that moment that her time with Paddy was over. He was longing to test himself in the experience of war and immediately made plans to return home and join up. Now, at this stage, he still has his original 4 diaries, which he kept during the course of his Great Walk. But in his haste to get back to England, he accidentally left the last of these diaries in Romania. When Paddy began his training, he was hoping to join the Irish Guards, but it was the intelligence corps that gave him a commission on the strength of his languages. And after training, he was sent to Greece with the Allied military mission in 1940. And he was on the Greek-Albanian border when the Germans launched their combined invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece the following year. By the 26th of April, 1941, the swastika was flying over the Acropolis, and the Allies retreated to Crete. Paddy witnessed the German aerial invasion of the island, and by 28th of May, Crete too had fallen to the enemy, and the Allies were forced back to Egypt. Paddy spent the next year in Egypt and Palestine, where he was trained in clandestine warfare by the Special Operations Executive, or SOE, which is the British equivalent of the OSS. And in June 1942, he was smuggled back into Crete as one of a handful of SOE officers whose job it was to support the Cretan resistance. Paddy is always associated with the celebrated abduction of General Kuyper, but his first 15 months that he spent on the island were every bit as exciting and dangerous, and I don't think that the Kuyper operation could have taken place without the experience and contacts that he made at that time. He grew his moustache and dyed his hair black, and his fake identity papers had him as Michali Frangidakis, a 27-year-old cultivator from a village near Retimnon. But while he might look like a Cretan, his Greek was still very obviously that of a foreigner, and on the rare occasions when he had to take buses or be in a public place, he was uncharacteristically silent, while his Cretan companions would pretend that he was a simple-minded cousin. Now, the information being gathered in 1942 and 43 by the Cretans was of crucial importance, since the Germans were using Crete as a huge transit camp and supply depot for their campaign in North Africa. And the intelligence gathered, much of it by Cretans who'd been forced to work for the enemy in one capacity or another, was relayed to secret wireless stations in the mountains and broadcast to Allied GHQ in Cairo in Egypt. Now, for Paddy and the Cretan Andartes that he worked with, and Andarte, by the way, means a partisan, an insurgent, life was a mixture of monotony and danger, all centered around the heavy, unwieldy, easily breakable radio sets on which so much depended. Wireless activity could be detected by German reconnaissance planes, so these great wireless sets were often moved, usually at night, mostly on human backs. And in January 1943, Paddy and a group of Cretans shifting the equipment were almost ambushed by several hundred Germans who had fanned out across the hillside to look for them. Paddy and 2 of his companions had to spend the whole of one freezing day hiding in the thick branches of a cypress tree, while the Germans were literally thrashing around under their feet. And a few months later, there occurred an accident which was going to haunt Paddy for the rest of his life. Sorry, I'm just going to take a quick drink before I start coughing. This is a very exciting moment, by the way. It's worth the wait. Nah, too late now. We'll crack on. Yes, an accident. This was really going to haunt Paddy for the rest of his life. He and his guide, Yanni Zangarakis, were above the village of Anoia with about a dozen Cretan Andates, when some 300 Germans were spotted making their way up the valley. Now, this was no immediate cause for alarm. The Germans were always prowling around, although luckily they seldom left the main paths, partly for fear of snipers, and partly because they found it very difficult to find anybody reliable enough to, or willing to guide them into the interior. Everyone quietly reached for his rifle, and these had all been cleaned and oiled that morning, and Paddy had also seen some of the younger members of the group practicing rifle drill. Paddy picked up his gun and drew the bolt backwards and forwards, easing the springs. And in performing this action, neither hand should be anywhere near the trigger. But somehow Paddy's was, and somehow the gun went off. The bullet, he was holding the gun downwards, but the bullet ricocheted off a rock and went through the thigh of his guide, Yanni Zangarakis, who was sitting on the ground doing up his sariki, and it went through his body like that. And within an hour, Yanni Zangarakis was dead of internal injuries. Paddy, you can imagine, was shocked and appalled by what he'd done, particularly since he and Zangarakis had worked together for many months and were close friends. He wanted to go immediately to the Zangarakis village of Fotinu and explain what had happened to Yanni's family and beg their forgiveness. But all the Cretans present said absolutely not. They refused to allow it. They said that in these difficult times, evil tongues would say that Paddy had killed Yanni because he was a traitor or because he knew all the secrets of the English. So they made Paddy swear that he would not go to Fotinu until after the occupation was over. And in the meantime, they would say that their party had been caught in a German ambush and that Yanni had been killed in the scramble to escape. Now, Paddy did go to Fotinu after the war, and he tried to explain what had happened to Kanaki, who is Yanni's brother. And Yanni said, "Is it true you killed my brother?" Paddy said, "Yes, I did, but it was a terrible mistake. It was too late. Yanni had turned on his heel and he'd gone. He wasn't going to listen to another word." And from that moment on, Paddy was the target of a vendetta. And this meant that he had to be terribly careful when he came back to Crete. He often saw one of the Zangarakis men on a hillside waiting for him with a rifle over their knees and binoculars. But as long as Paddy was accompanied by somebody who was not in feud with the Zangarakis clan, then he was safe. And this vendetta was only lifted in 1972, and the reconciliation was sealed in the traditional manner, with Paddy standing godfather to one of the Zangarakis' children. And I must just finish this story because it's so funny. So they have this terrific feast. They've baptized the little girl, and Paddy is sitting next to the Zangarakis' father, who's been trying to kill him for the last 20 years, but now all that's forgotten, the vendetta is over. And so there they are together, and Mr. Zangarakis says to Paddy, now, godbrother Michali, by the way, Paddy is always known as Michali in Greece, godbrother Michali, you're family now. So if there's anyone you want to get rid of, anyone at all, you just let me know. Anyway, now we're going to go back to 1943 to pick up the story of Paddy's War. A few weeks after the death of Yanni Zangarakis in late July, Benito Mussolini fell from power in Italy and was replaced by Marshal Badoglio. And the Italian troops, if you remember, Crete is a long, thin island. We've got the Germans in the west, and the Italians are occupying the east of the country. So the Italians in the eastern part of Crete were ecstatic, thinking that they would soon be home. but their commanders, foreseeing an armistice, feared that they might be interned on Crete if they didn't surrender their arms to the Germans. And it was at this point that General Angelo Carta, commanding the Siena division in Neapolis, secretly got in touch with SOE to see if he could get off the island. Paddy was very keen to help, arranged everything, and got the captain safely across the island. And then there was a naval launch waiting outside, and Paddy accompanied the general onto the boat. But once he was on the boat, suddenly the wind got up, the rain started, huge waves, and he was forced to accompany, although he was going to go back to the island, that could not be done. The captain refused to lower the tender, so Paddy was forced to go back all the way to Egypt. And having got an Italian general off the island, there he is now in Cairo, he now conceived a plan for kidnapping a German general. And not just any German general, but one called General Friedrich Wilhelm Müller, the divisional commander of the Heraklion sector, central sector in Crete, who'd been responsible for a series of savage reprisals against Cretan civilians just before Paddy had left the island. And the kidnap plan was given the go-ahead by SOE in Cairo, and Paddy put together his core team, which consisted of two seasoned Cretan resistance fighters, Manoli Paterakis and George Tirakis. But Paddy also needed someone who could pass for a German and who was a good driver. And his choice fell on a young officer called William Stanley Moss. Paddy was dropped into Crete in February 1944 by parachute. But the dropping zone was so small, like a little sort of saucer in the mountains, that instead of dropping each man one after the other in a long line, the pilot had to do a complete circle and drop each man into the dropping zone separately. So they drop Paddy okay, he gives the signal with the torch, yes, I'm down, all right. Paddy, and the pilot goes into that second turn to drop the next man, and at that moment, the weather closes in again. And it's 7 weeks before the team can rejoin Paddy. And in those 7 weeks, wouldn't you know it, General Müller, their target, is promoted and moved to Hanya, which is the western capital of the island, where the Germans are strongest. And there is absolutely no way they're going to be able to kidnap him from there. So Paddy feared at that point that the whole mission would be aborted, but SOE Cairo decided that it should go ahead, and the target was Müller's replacement in that central Heraklion sector. And his name was General Heinrich Kreiper, and nobody knew anything about him because he'd only just arrived from the Russian front. Now, General Kreiper was captured on the evening of the 26th of April as he drove from his headquarters to his villa in Knossos. And in years to come, careless retellings of the story always irritated Paddy by implying that he and Billy Moss had carried out this coup all by themselves without any reference to the Cretan guides, lookouts and snipers who'd look after them, nor the villagers and shepherds who kept them hidden and fed at appalling risk to themselves. Paddy had done his utmost to avoid reprisals, and yet while it can't be denied that the Germans did retaliate, the Kreiper operation was not the main reason for the pitiless destruction of several Cretan villages in August 1944. And as for their prize, I always felt a bit sorry for poor General Kreiper. He was not a popular general, but neither was he a brutal sadist like Müller. And Paddy was far too busy with the problems that arose every day to keep notes, so it was left to Billy to keep an account of the kidnap, which eventually became a bestseller, Ill Met by Moonlight, and then a film in which Paddy was played by Dirk Bogarde. And after several very close shaves, the general was taken off the island, and in the fullness of time, Paddy was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for leading the operation. And when he returned to London in 1945, at a time when every man was defined by what sort of a war he had had, Paddy was celebrated as a hero. By this time, he had met Joan Ayres Munsell, a remarkable photographer who eventually became his wife. And they travelled together in Greece in 1946, where Paddy was briefly employed by the British Council, and 2 years later on a journey around the islands of the Caribbean, which became the subject of Paddy's first book, A Traveller's Tree. And the more he travelled around the Antilles, the more he found that the deadening effects of slavery had gone deeper and done more damage to this culture, this island culture, than he could ever have imagined. And Paddy also believed that the sufferings of the slaves and their enforced exile from Africa lay at the heart of the voodoo rituals and possessions that he witnessed in Haiti. Paddy and Joan attended a number of voodoo ceremonies and talked about them to Ian Fleming, who they went to see at Goldeneye in Jamaica in the winter of 1947. And at that time, Fleming was working on his first James Bond novel, which was, of course, Casino Royale. But Paddy's descriptions of voodoo are quoted at length in his second, Live and Let Die. The Traveller's Tree, his first book, won the Heinemann Prize for Literature, which marked Paddy as a young writer to watch. And it appeared in 1950 and was followed by 3 books. A Time to Keep Silence, which was about his experiences in the monasteries of Normandy, his only novel, The Violins of Saint-Jacques, and The Cretan Runner, which was not by Paddy, but by his friend George Sikundakis. Now, Sikundakis was a poor shepherd from a village, mountain village in Crete called Azigonia, and he was 21 when the war broke out. And he worked tirelessly for SOE as a runner throughout the occupation of Crete. And although he had been awarded a medal by the British in recognition of his work, because his military papers were not in order, the Greek authorities had thrown him into prison as a deserter. And Sikundakis had written his war memoirs to keep himself sane while he was in prison. And Paddy was so impressed by this account that he persuaded his publisher, John Murray, to publish it. And Paddy translated the book himself into Greek. And then Paddy turned his attention back to Greece, the country that he and Joan loved above all others. His first Greek book was called Mani, from which that first passage about the dolphins comes. And survival was very hard. The Mani is a very sort of bright, brilliant, rocky place. But Paddy felt that the Maniots, very, very poor, very remote region of Greece, had developed the same sort of toughness and humour that had sustained the Cretans throughout the occupation. And Mani appeared in 1958, and its companion volume, Rumili, came out sometime later. Now, for years, Paddy and Joan had dreamed of settling in Greece, and in the summer of 1962, they found the ideal spot, which was a headland surrounded by olive groves, overlooking the sea, just south of the village of Kardamili in the Mani. And they were just negotiating the purchase of the land, which is always a very difficult, fraught business in Greece, when the American magazine Holiday asked Paddy to write an article on the pleasures of walking. And without thinking it through very carefully, Paddy sat down and began to give an account of his great trek across Europe. But it was only now, 3 decades after the walk itself, that early walk across Europe, years in which he'd learnt and read so much more about the history and art of Europe than he ever knew when he was aged 18 or 19, that Paddy realised just how much he had to say. And having to compress it all into 2,000 words for an article was obviously intensely frustrating. And he'd written about 2/3 of the book when, as he described it, an explosion took place. And with an enormous sigh of relief, as if I had wriggled out of a straitjacket, I continued the journey at normal pace. And Paddy called this proto-book, the first thing that he'd really written about his early journey, he called it A Youthful Journey. And 2 years later, in early 1964, it stood at about 84,000 words. The book has changed, he wrote to John Murray, and I think ripened out of all recognition. It's much more personal, far livelier in pace, and lots of it, I hope, very odd. I wonder what Holiday magazine will say. Well, having had to wait 2 years for an article that was now a book, what Holiday magazine had to say was probably unrepeatable, but they decided to give him another chance. And in 1965, they commissioned him to write a long article on the Danube, from its source in the Black Forest to its bird-haunted delta on the Romanian coast of the Black Sea. Paddy leapt at the opportunity, for although they had exchanged the occasional letter, he had not seen Balasha Cantacuzene since he'd left her to go to war in 1939. Now, of course, Romania had been shut off for decades behind the communist Iron Curtain, and being aristocrats, the Cantacuzines had suffered greatly during those years. Their family house and estates at Baleni on the eastern border of Romania had been confiscated, and they were living in an attic in a town called Pucioasa, which is about 100 miles north of the capital, Bucharest. And they survived there by teaching English and French. Romania was beginning to open up a little bit in 1965, but fraternizing with foreigners could still get you into very serious trouble. So Paddy had to come to see the Cantacuzines after dark and in secret. Balasha was overjoyed to see him again, although Paddy was dismayed to see how broken and ill she looked. He spent the next 24 hours with Balasha and her sister and her brother-in-law. Nobody slept. The time was too precious. And while Paddy was there, Balasha put into his hands the diary that he'd left behind all those years ago. And she'd kept it safe all that time. And on the night of their eviction from her family home, when they'd been given 15 minutes to pack, and they were told they could only take one small suitcase, she'd remembered to throw that diary into the suitcase and take it with her. And from now on until her death in 1976, both Paddy and Joan wrote regularly to Balasha, urging her to visit them, but she never would. She was very deaf by that time, and I think she just wanted to live in her memories. But she did write wonderful letters, reliving her and Paddy's life together before the war, and I relied on them enormously when I came to write the biography. Now, Paddy, you can imagine, he's hugely excited to have this diary back, because by now he knows that everything else that he wrote at the time had been lost, vanished, gone forever. So why, having brought the diary home, did he make so little use of it? He thought it was going to unlock the past, but as he read it, I think he was deeply shaken, more so than he could ever admit, by the way that the diary and a youthful journey that he'd written, this extended article, deviated, diverged. The brisk, uncomplicated jottings in the diary reveal his day-to-day life as he lived it. But in a youthful journey, his experiences had been transformed into something infinitely more colourful and lyrical and emotionally charged. In fact, a sort of fiction. And the diary also revealed the gap between the 19-year-old he was then, sometimes pleased with himself, sometimes touchingly vulnerable, and the more rounded, poetic figure that Paddy's memory had turned his youthful self into. So on his return to Greece, he set a youthful journey and the diary aside and began to write the story of the walk all over again from the beginning. By 1967, the house at Kardamili was built, and for the first time in his life, Paddy was settled in his own study with all his books. But writing, for him, had never come easily. And by now he felt that he had so much to say that the walk should be published as a trilogy. The first part, A Time of Gifts, would take the reader as far as the edge of Hungary, and its composition was an ever-evolving, painfully slow process, subject to constant redrafting and rewriting. A Time of Gifts, I mean, if you haven't read Paddy Leigh Fermor, do start with that one. It's a description of all that was most precious to him across one particular swathe of European culture, and it was built up layer upon layer over the course of a decade or more. And these strata of writing are folded and overlaid with painstaking skill, richly detailed in some passages, deliberately blurred in others, hilariously funny one moment, and delving into the depths of historical conjecture the next. And the overall effect is not just the journey of one young man in the early 1930s, but a vision of a kind of timeless Europe suspended somewhere between memory and imagination. Paddy was delighted by the success of A Time of Gifts. It's really his first bestseller, and the enthusiasm of his readers. But his loyal fans had to wait another 9 years for Between the Woods and the Water, which came out in 1986, although the consensus was that the wait had been worth it. This volume describes the enchanted summer of 1934 which Paddy spent travelling from one country house to another across eastern Hungary and Transylvania as the guest of a series of aristocratic and cosmopolitan Hungarians. And the book ends with the implacable words, "To be concluded." But that third volume never appeared during his lifetime. What happened? What happened to it? Well, I think several baleful influences were at work here. The very success of the first two volumes had encouraged a sense of expectation which Paddy found very hard to cope with. And almost everyone he met from now on would ask him how he was getting on with Vol 3. And also, we must not forget that by 1986, when Between the Woods and the Water was published, Paddy had been working on his trans-European walk for over 2 decades. And I think part of him felt completely written out on the subject. And yet, he'd already written A Youthful Journey, which covered the last third of the walk. Although the manuscript breaks off in Constantinople, when Constantinople is still 2 or 3 days away. But, there it was. Surely it was just a question of tidying it up, writing the final pages and posting it to the printer. But it was never that easy, not for Paddy. And the main stumbling block was still what it was in 1965. The story told by his one surviving diary was so different in tone and texture to the story put together from memory and imagination that it had shaken his confidence in what he'd written of that final volume. And I think he hints at this towards the end of A Youthful Journey when he considers a passage which is described in great detail in his surviving diary. So, wrote Paddy, instead of piecing together these fragments by memory, I'm surrounded by a windfall of day-to-day jottings, too rough and abbreviated to use as they stand. And in some ways, this abundance is a bit of an embarrassment. To make use of it all would mean a change of focus, a shift in key. And there it is again, the old malaise. Paddy still found it impossible to reconcile the naked facts as his journey had been in the diary with what he had spun certain moments into pure fiction. And I think the very existence of the diary lay at the heart of the writer's block that afflicted him for the next 20 years and made it impossible for him to finish the trilogy. So why didn't he just throw it into the fire? He could have done. There was always an open fire there. In fact, it rather worried me sometimes. But I don't think the thought ever crossed his mind. Because by that time, the diary had acquired a significance out of all proportion to what was inside it. And he could not throw away, after all, what Balasha had preserved with such care and love all those years. So the years passed and the deadlines came and went, and John Murray died in 1993, and Joan, Paddy's wife, died a decade later. And with their deaths, the last volume seemed to sink ever deeper into oblivion. I didn't really begin writing Paddy's biography until 2004, a year after Joan's death. And at that stage, he wouldn't let me read the Green Diary. And when I asked if I could read A Youthful Journey, he said, I'd really rather you didn't. It's all got to be unpicked. Terrible word. And he looked so wretched and downcast that I didn't have the heart to press him further. And then in 2007, I found a typescript of A Youthful Journey in the archive of his publisher, John Murray, and I immediately dispatched a copy to Paddy in Greece. And he must have forgotten that he already had it lodged in 3 black ring binders on his shelves. So he was delighted and sort of treated this as a work long lost, now rediscovered. Paddy was in his 90s, and he suffered from tunnel vision, which meant that he could only see a few words of text at a time. But he set to work with a will, and meanwhile Olivia Stewart, a close friend of the Leigh Fermors, who'd been an invaluable support to Paddy after Joan's death, realised that this was his last chance to complete the book. So with Paddy's permission, she had both the Green Diary and A Youthful Journey typed up in a digital format and printed out in a large font. And Paddy seemed to acquire a new determination to complete the trilogy, and he asked me to send him some large-scale maps of Romania and Bulgaria, and also a Bulgarian dictionary. And whenever anyone asked me whether Vol 3 would ever appear, I replied that Paddy was hard at work on it, which was true. But I also knew that he no longer had the energy to build up those extraordinary layers of memory and learning and imagination anymore. And the changes that he did make to the text were largely stylistic, replacing one word with another. His final illness left him very tired, but he never gave up. And he always put in an hour or two at his desk if he could. And I have no doubt in my mind that he wanted to see his last book published. It was a personal tragedy for him that he died before it was finished, but perhaps it was the price he had to pay for having lived too full a life. But the text has been published by Colin Thubron and myself, and it has now appeared as The Broken Road. But I'd like to bring your attention to my biography, which is on sale in the tent there. Just a couple more words about it. It's said that biographers should not be too friendly with their subjects. And I have to admit, I knew him since childhood. Paddy was a friend of my grandmother and my father before he was a friend of mine. But Paddy was a scrupulously private person, and I know that he wouldn't have opened up so much to somebody he didn't know and trust very well. And sometimes he would tell me a story, and he would say, "You won't put that in, will you?" Or, "You won't let on, will you?" And I reassured him every time, rat that I am, and every one of those stories is in the book. I can't deny that I found him one of the funniest and kindest and most interesting people I've ever met. But I hope you don't think that's such a bad thing, because every biography is a betrayal, but surely it should also make the case for the defense. Thank you very much. Sorry, I took up all the available.
Time for maybe 5 minutes of questions.
What's the name of the book?
The last volume? Oh, the biography. I think it's called, what is it called? Patrick. An Adventure, that's what it's called, yes. Patrick Leigh Fermor, An Adventure. I'm sorry? I'm not sure, to tell you the truth. Are Paddy's books available in the?
You can get them in order them.
You could, yes.
Time of Gifts as the must-buy.
That's right. Paddy. That's right. As definitely a must-buy.
Time to Keep Silence.
Time to Keep Silence.
second.
Absolutely.
Mani, then Romelli, probably.
That's
that
right.
order.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, The Broken Road, which is amazing.
Broken
the last,
Road, which you could.
but I mean, the whole of the trilogy. If you just Google, Patrick Leigh Fermor, you'll find all the list. Or indeed, buy my biography. They're all listed there.
I was just going to say that in Delhi, it's available at the bookstore in Dalrymple.
Fantastic. At Delhi, it's available. They're available at the
Katie
bookstore.
Singh's Jawbug Book. Any other questions? One at the back here.
Could you please share a little bit more about how you put together The Broken Road? A little bit more detail there.
Right, about The Broken Road. Well, the thing about The Broken Road, the last volume, yes, that was already there. There was actually very, very little to do on it. And in fact, because I had been working on the biography, it was largely Colin Thubron, a wonderful writer. He was the one who really established the text. Because, of course, as soon as you've got something in computer form, you seem to generate more and more copies of it. But there was really very little work to be done on the first part of the book, which is A Youthful Journey. And the second part of the book is actually taken from that original diary itself, and it's his account of Mount Athos. But there is scarcely a single word of ours in that text. It's all Paddy. Well, funny. Well, not really. The funny thing was is that whenever he talked about Vol 3 to me, he always said that he wanted it to go not only as far as Mount Athos, but beyond. So we felt that that would be, and he was correcting the Mount Athos bit. He definitely saw it as part of the book. Although that particular passage, as I say, had been written when he was 18, 19, and A Youthful Journey, which is the bigger part of the book, which takes him through Romania and Bulgaria, was written sort of in his late 40s, early 50s. So they sound very different, and it's one reason, I think, why the title, The Broken Road, sort of reflects that. It is two separate pieces joined with a sort of linking passage. But I think that another difficulty with the book was that actually his time in Constantinople, which should have been the great golden climax of the whole thing, was actually a dreadful disappointment. He didn't like Constantinople. I don't know why. I think he was in a very odd mood. There is something when you finish a kind of epic
There was
journey.
girl trouble, wasn't there?
A bit of girl trouble. I don't think that mattered so much, though, but it wasn't so much the girl trouble. I think it was just, you know, I've made this amazing journey, and I'm still the same person. You know, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? That question was still there.
There's a nice quote by Richard Burton when he finally leaves Mecca, and the depression of the traveller who's achieved his goal, like
Exactly.
Alexander the Great.
Absolutely.
Having nowhere
Yes, are there no more, countries to conquer? Yes.
Cordelia.
His letters, yes, absolutely. He was a wonderful letter writer.
Terribly bad handwriting, though.
Yeah, the handwriting was wicked, but you sort of got used to that, you know. He had three correspondents who sort of brought out the best in his letter writing. There was my grandmother, Diana Cooper, Deborah, Duchess of Devonshire, and Anne Fleming. And they were all, those three women, also brilliant letter writers. And they
Maybe explain to this audience who all those three are.
Ah, right. Well, my grandmother was sort of celebrated beauty, Lady Diana Cooper. She was married to a politician. I think the great thing about all three of them, and of course, Anne Fleming was married to Ian Fleming, that was husband number 3, I think. But the point about all those three women, they were society women, they were highly intelligent, they had lots of gossip, and they wrote very good letters. And so those were the sort of people that he liked to write to, because he wanted to, these letters are about entertainment. You know, when you get a letter from Paddy, my grandmother was always delighted. It took her 2 days to work it out because the handwriting was so bad. But after that, she was sort of sharing it with everybody. And equally, I think when he got a letter from Annie Fleming or my grandmother or Deborah Devonshire, you know, it was something you sort of stored up like some gorgeous treat. So these letters had to be very good. And he worked very hard at them. And there are very often times when either of those three women write to him saying, Paddy, you know, have you forgotten me? What's happened? I haven't heard from you for 6 months. Where are you? And he would write back saying, yes, but I want to write you the perfect letter. And I've never been quite in the mood, or it hasn't gone right. And I don't just want to write you 2 or 3 lines. I want to write you a wonderful screed full of stuff. So the letters are very good, both ways. And of course, one series of them has been published with Deborah Devonshire. You can see how good they are. It's called In Tearing Haste, came out in 2008. I don't think that the other two, I mean, they may be edited and published, but I'm not entirely sure they will, because they very often kind of, he's going through the same things, and often he'll write the same sort of, he'll tell the same story to all three of them. So there'll be slight repetitions.
Artemis, can you maybe end with my favourite letter in your biography, where he's writing to the girlfriend in Paris after...
Oh my God, not that one.
Can you remember it by heart?
No, I can't, can you? I can find it in the biography, but I better not. Go on, you do it.
Just look in the index under crabs.
That's right. Look in the index under crabs. It is hysterically funny. And I said to my father, do I dare publish this? And he said, I'll never forgive you if you don't.
Just maybe conclude by just saying something about Paddy and women, because it was such an important part of his life.
Paddy and women, yes. Paddy loved women. it was very, I mean, there were sort of two sides to Paddy's love of women. He loved to be around, as I say, beautiful, elegant women who could entertain him with gossip and stories and stuff like that. He had a great many affairs, and he also, as Willie perhaps slightly indicated with the crabs, he also had a tendency to sort of, he loved what he called noctambulism, which basically meant the seamy side of life in all its glory. Prostitutes, hash dens, nightclubs, you know, wrestling matches with all kinds of, everything, every thrill you could have after dark, Paddy was up for. And he was one of those people too, who hated going to bed. So lots of women in his life. And I think, funny enough, it's one of the things that strikes me too, is that there aren't many letters to men. He shines better. He's more eloquent in the company of women and really loved their company as well as the pleasure of being in bed with them. And so, yes, he was certainly, there are a great many women in the book.
Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Artemis Cooper. Go by her wonderful